Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're focusing on a really fascinating piece of source material.
Yeah, it's a very specific translated audio interview.
Right, from a broadcast on Radio Irava.
Right.
And it features Mr. Shahram Golestaneh from the Iran Democratic Association in Canada.
Which is going to give us a lot to unpack today.
Exactly. Our mission today is to essentially map out the arguments, the political strategies, and, the historical context around a recent conference that was held in the Canadian Parliament.
Right, a conference that was entirely focused on the human rights situation in Iran.
Yeah. But before we get into the actual mechanics of that conference, it is absolutely essential to frame how we're approaching this material for you, our listener.
Yes, very important. Because the geopolitical landscape surrounding the Iranian regime, the various opposition groups, and foreign policy in general, it is highly, highly charged.
So we need to put this right out front. We are not taking sides on these issues.
No, not at all.
Nor are we endorsing the viewpoints, the specific opposition groups, or any of the political stances mentioned in this broadcast. Our sole objective for this deep dive is to impartially report on and analyze the arguments exactly as they are laid out in this translated interview.
We're basically just here to understand the architecture of their perspective.
Exactly. And the reason we're doing this is because the core argument they're presenting is it's structurally explosive.
It really is.
Imagine for a second that a highly entrenched, heavily armed authoritarian regime suddenly, overnight, decided to completely stop executing its political prisoners.
Just put a halt to all of it.
Yeah, no more crackdowns, no more capital punishment for dissent. What do you think would happen?
I mean, you might logically assume it would lead to a thawing of relations, right?
Right, like maybe a gradual transition to a more open society or something.
But according to the arguments in this interview, the answer is the exact opposite.
Oh, completely. Mr. Golestaneh argues that if this specific regime stopped its executions tomorrow, it wouldn't reform. It would collapse.
Entirely collapse.
And not just collapse, but fall 10 times faster than previous governments, triggering a million-person uprising overnight.
It's a really striking premise to start with, because it essentially argues that for certain types of regimes, extreme suppression isn't just, a policy tool they can choose to put back in the toolbox.
Right.
It's the structural foundation of their very existence. Like, if you pull that lever, the whole machine breaks down.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of why they believe that collapse would happen so fast.
Yeah.
But first, let's establish the setting.
Sure.
This entire broadcast centers around a conference that took place on May 27th or the 6th of Khordad in the Persian calendar. What was the explicit purpose of this gathering in Ottawa?
Well, the conference was held right at the Canadian Parliament. And it's notable because it was co-chaired by two politicians from completely across the aisle.
Oh, right. Liberal MP Judy Sgro and Conservative MP Michael Cooper. Exactly. And the primary singular focus of this gathering was the severe human rights violations and the widespread executions of political prisoners in Iran.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the attendees and the speakers who represent the Iranian resistance were there with a really specific strategic goal in mind regarding how Western nations prioritize foreign policy.
Yeah, they have a very clear objective here.
Let me introduce an analogy because it feels like there is a chronic problem with how global politics operates. It's kind of like geopolitical triage.
Triage. I like that.
Yeah, like if a politician in Ottawa or London is bleeding from the neck because oil prices are spiking or regional wars are threatening to break out and shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz are blocked.
They're putting all their attention on that neck wound.
Right. They aren't going to treat a broken finger, which is, tragically, how they often view internal human rights abuses in foreign nations. So how does this conference propose to change that dynamic? Because right now, human rights seems to always get pushed to the back burner.
That triage analogy is exactly the problem Mr. Golestaneh highlights in the interview. When Western leaders look at the Middle East, their immediate bandwidth is entirely consumed by macro security threats.
Right, like is there a nuclear escalation?
Exactly. Or are energy markets crashing? The deafening buzz of those immediate hard power security issues completely drowns out the systemic human rights abuses happening inside the country's prisons.
So human rights inevitably get sidelined.
Yes. So the resistance has to figure out a way to prove that the broken finger and the neck wound are actually caused by the exact same disease.
Ah, I see.
Precisely. The mission of this conference is to force human rights back to the very front of the international agenda and they're explicitly asking Canada to take the lead.
And they aren't just asking Canada randomly, right?
No, not at all. The interview points out that historically, Canada has been the specific country to step up and sponsor UN resolutions condemning the Iranian regime's human rights abuses.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize Canada had that track record.
Yeah, so the argument presented is that Canada has the established diplomatic experience to rally the global community on this specific moral front. The resistance wants to end the cycle where the suffering of the Iranian people is just treated as a secondary soft issue.
Right, an issue that only gets attention when the geopolitical weather is clear.
Exactly.
But if we look at this from the regime's perspective, I have to ask a question about their strategy. If their international standing is constantly battered by these human rights condemnations.
Right, if executions are the exact thing uniting foreign parliaments against them.
Yeah, why do they keep doing it? I mean, dictatorships are usually pretty focused on self-preservation, so why continue a practice that isolates them so severely?
Well, that brings us right back to the premise we opened with. The speakers at the conference assert that executions are literally baked into the DNA of this regime.
It baked in.
Yeah. It's not a diplomatic choice. It's a desperate survival mechanism driven by what they describe as a massive legitimacy deficit.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because I understand the fear aspect, but dictatorships have survived for decades on fear alone.
Sure, they have.
So what makes the interview so sure that this specific regime is relying entirely on executions just to stay breathing?
Well, according to the framework laid out on the broadcast, the current regime lacks both popular and international legitimacy.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with popular legitimacy.
Domestically, they don't derive power from democratic elections. The interview stresses that there are no genuine referendums to gauge the will of the majority.
Right.
Instead, you have forced succession plans. The speakers specifically pointed to alleged preparations to install the current supreme leader's son into power.
Oh, wow.
So their popular mandate is functionally zero. And then internationally, their legitimacy is crippled by ongoing associations with regional instability.
Right. So if you have no mandate from your citizens and you have no goodwill from the global community.
The only thing keeping you in power is the absolute suppression of dissent.
So the executions aren't just punishments. They are the load-bearing walls of the state.
That is the core argument. The regime views the continuation of executions as its sole path to survival. To stop would signal weakness. And in their calculus, weakness invites immediate collapse.
This is where the historical comparison in the interview gets really fascinating, because they don't just theorize about this collapse, they point back to the 1970s.
Yes, the Carter era.
Right. Mr. Golestaneh argues that if the current regime abandoned executions, they'd fall 10 times faster than the Shah did. Because when U.S. President Jimmy Carter applied heavy diplomatic pressure on the Shah regarding human rights,
The Shah loosened his grip on the secret police.
exactly, and his regime unraveled in about a year. So the argument here is that the current apparatus is so much more brittle and the public anger is so much deeper that a similar easing of pressure would result in a massive uprising literally the next day.
But, the interview acknowledges a pretty grim reality. The regime understands this historical lesson perfectly. They know what happened to the Shah.
Right, they aren't ignorant of history.
Exactly. Therefore, the resistance argues that expecting the current leadership to voluntarily ease up or reform is just a dangerous delusion.
Which really casts a shadow over the idea of peaceful street protests.
It does.
The interview mentions recent winter protests, basically arguing that if you bring 1 million people to the streets peacefully, but the regime hasn't put down its weapons,
It just results in mass casualties.
yeah, which is horrific.
They argue that peaceful protest against an entity whose DNA is violent suppression only leads to tragedy. And this creates a very difficult strategic puzzle for the international community.
A puzzle that was addressed head-on at the Ottawa conference by Ambassador Robert Joseph, right? The former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control.
Yes. Let's talk about his argument.
Yeah.
Because he forcefully rejected a false dichotomy that Western nations often fall into.
Right. He basically said the world doesn't only have 2 choices on the menu when dealing with Iran.
Exactly. The first option usually presented is appeasement-making concessions, easing sanctions, hoping negotiations will incentivize the regime to change.
But the interview argues appeasement only emboldens them to act with more impunity.
Right. And the second option on that menu is usually foreign military intervention, the all-out war model.
Like the kind of regime change we saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya?
Yes, and Ambassador Joseph, aligning completely with the resistance's stance, rejects that model too. They argue that foreign wars are disastrous, destructive, and entirely unsuited for bringing genuine democracy to Iran.
Yeah, you can't drop a democratic republic from foreign bombers.
Precisely.
So they're pitching a third option. If asking nicely doesn't work and foreign invasion is off the table, what is the actual mechanism for change being proposed?
The third option is regime change from within, but not just a spontaneous, chaotic uprising.
Okay, what do they mean by that?
They're advocating for change led by the Iranian people, but organized and spearheaded by an internal resistance. The broadcast talks extensively about resistance units.
Okay, I have to pause here. Because if you are listening to this, you're probably wondering how that actually functions in reality.
That's a fair question.
Right. In a state with a secret police, mass surveillance, and a proven willingness to execute dissenters, how do you organize resistance units without immediately getting caught and dismantled?
Well, it is incredibly dangerous work. While the interview doesn't provide a tactical manual, obviously.
Sure, they can't give away their secrets.
Right. But the concept of these units relies on highly decentralized, compartmentalized networks operating inside the country. They aren't trying to field a traditional army.
So what are they doing?
They're organizing small, localized cells that coordinate anti-regime activities, spread information, and basically keep the momentum of the opposition alive.
Got it.
The goal is to have a structured skeleton in place so that when larger protests do erupt, they have direction and focus, rather than just being a chaotic release of anger that the regime can easily isolate and crush.
Okay, so change from within sounds much more structured than just hoping for a spontaneous revolution. But that leads to the next major skepticism.
Which is?
Well, history is full of resistance groups who fight bravely against a dictator, only to seize the palace and become the new dictators themselves. We see it constantly.
We really do.
So how does the listener know this organized resistance isn't just positioning itself for a massive power grab?
That is probably the most critical question any opposition movement faces. And the interview spends significant time explaining how they differentiate themselves.
How so?
They draw a very sharp line between what they call fake internal opposition and their own movement.
Fake opposition. How do they define that?
According to the broadcasts, there are dissenting voices that only seek superficial reforms. Like, they might advocate for slightly relaxing the mandatory hijab laws or making minor economic adjustments.
Just putting a Band-Aid on it.
Exactly. The resistance argues these groups are just trying to act as a pressure release valve to save the core structure of the regime from exploding. The organized resistance, however, demands total systemic change.
And their blueprint for what comes next is called a 10-point plan, right?
Yes, authored by Maryam Rajavi, the leader of the opposition coalition.
And the speakers of the Canadian Parliament explicitly backed this plan. But what does a 10-point plan actually entail? Because if it's just vague promises, it doesn't mean much.
The plan is actually quite specific. The interview highlights that it calls for a secular republic.
Meaning a strict separation of religion and state.
Yes, a total reversal of the current system. It guarantees gender equality in all political and social arenas, recognizes the rights of ethnic minorities, and commits to a non-nuclear Iran that lives in peaceful coexistence with its neighbors.
I mean, that is a massive overhaul of the state apparatus.
It is.
But, you know, the part of the interview that really made me stop and reread my notes wasn't the final goal of the plan, it was the timeline.
Oh, the transitional government?
Yeah. The resistance is proposing a transitional government that would last for exactly 6 months.
Yes. A 6-month window to bridge the gap between the fall of the old regime and the establishment of the new one.
If you're listening to this, you are probably thinking, 6 months? That's impossible.
And it sounds incredibly fast.
Right. You can't even untangle the bureaucracy of a corrupt state in 6 months, let alone organize a nationwide election in a country that hasn't had a truly free one in generations.
Right.
What prevents a military coup in that chaotic 6-month window? How does the resistance actually justify that timeline?
Well, the brevity of the transition was heavily debated internally. The interview notes that when this 6-month plan was proposed within the National Council of Resistance, critics brought up those exact points.
I'm sure they did.
They argued 6 months was dangerously short to stabilize an economy, investigate past crimes, and set up ballot boxes across a massive nation.
So why stick to it? Why not give themselves 2 or 3 years to stabilize things?
Because of trust. The leadership argued that the current regime has so profoundly damaged the Iranian people's trust in any governing authority that the resistance must go to extreme lengths to prove they aren't just clinging to the throne.
Oh, I see.
The logic is that if they linger in a transitional phase for 3 or 4 years, the public will inevitably view them as just another dictatorship wearing a different hat.
So the goal of the 6-month government isn't to fix the country's problems.
Exactly. For the resistance, the explicit goal is not to hold power. The sole purpose of that 6-month window is to transfer power to its rightful owners as rapidly as physically possible.
Wow.
They just need to keep the lights on long enough for the Iranian people to elect a constituent assembly. Once that assembly is elected, they draft a new constitution and the transitional government dissolves.
Passing the baton immediately.
Yes. It's the only way they feel they can prove their democratic intentions to a deeply traumatized populace.
Okay, so they have this incredibly strict internal timeline to build trust with the Iranian people. But what about international trust?
That's a whole different challenge.
Right. They are an opposition movement operating largely in exile. How do they get politicians in Canada who fight bitterly over domestic issues to unite behind them? I mean, Judy Sigro and Michael Cooper represent parties that go after each other relentlessly in Ottawa.
They do.
Yet here they are co-chairing a conference together.
Well, the interview attributes this bipartisan success to a policy of extreme discipline neutrality regarding the domestic politics of their host countries.
So they just stay out of it.
Completely. The resistance outright refuses to take sides in the internal party disputes of Canada, the U.S., or European nations.
Mr. Golestaneh gave a really compelling example of this discipline in the broadcast. He talked about the time the resistance was physically based in Iraq during the U.S.-Iraq War.
Yes, that is a stark example. You have an opposition group based in a country that is literally being invaded.
The pressure to align with one side or the other must have been immense.
Exactly. Yet the interview states they completely refused to take a position on the war itself. They insisted their only fight was with the regime in Tehran, and they stayed out of the local conflict entirely.
So, by refusing to become a pawn in domestic or regional political games, they build a unique kind of credibility.
Yes, it creates a safe space for bipartisan agreement.
It allows politicians from completely opposing parties to unite on the moral issue of human rights in Iran without worrying that the resistance is going to suddenly endorse their political rivals in the next local election.
Right, and that bipartisan agreement is crucial for their global awareness campaigns. But the real question is, does all this international maneuvering actually yield tangible results?
Like, does raising awareness in Ottawa actually help the people inside Iran?
Exactly. And the broadcast offers a fantastic anecdote to answer that, involving the late Professor Maurice Copperthorne.
He was the former UN Special Representative for Human Rights in Iran.
Yes. And this is one of the most revealing moments in the interview. According to Mr. Golestaneh, Professor Copperthorne, who wasn't just a rubber stamp for the resistance, he actually had some political differences with them, made a profound admission.
What did he say?
He explicitly told the resistance that if they had not exposed the Iranian regime's clandestine nuclear program to the world, the issue of human rights in Iran wouldn't even be on the international table.
Wait, really? That is a staggering admission from a top UN official.
It is.
Let's connect that back to our triage analogy from earlier. The UN official is basically admitting, without your intelligence on the nuclear threat, the neck wound, the world would have just ignored the executions, the broken finger.
Yes. For the resistance, this is absolute proof of the tangible value of their campaigns. By linking the regime's secretive nature regarding nuclear weapons to its secretive nature regarding domestic massacres, they forced the international community to look at the human rights abuses.
They proved it's all part of the same disease.
Exactly. And the Canadian conference was designed to keep that momentum building. The interview mentions other speakers who added weight to this argument, too.
Oh, right. You had Kyle Matthews, a global security expert.
Yes, he drew direct structural comparisons between the current wave of executions and the infamous 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran.
Basically arguing that the world cannot treat these executions as isolated modern incidents. They're part of a continuous, decades-long pattern of behavior.
The conference also featured Ali Safavi, a member of the Resistance's Foreign Affairs Committee. He used his platform to address the future, specifically dismantling the arguments of monarchist groups who advocate for a return to the pre-1979 royal system.
Which brings us full circle to the desires of the Iranian people themselves and what kind of future they are actually trying to build. We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at how human rights get lost in the noise of global security, but the underlying takeaway seems to be that you can't separate the two. The executions aren't a side issue.
Right. According to this broadcast, they are the structural glue holding the regime together.
And we examined the resistance's rejection of both appeasement and foreign military intervention.
Favoring instead an organized internal push for a secular republic.
Right. We looked at the mechanics of their 6-month transition plan, which is designed not to govern, but to rapidly build trust by handing over power.
And we saw how their strict political neutrality allows them to build unprecedented bipartisan coalitions in places like the Canadian Parliament.
It is a lot to process. It's a profound look at how a nation tries to engineer its own freedom after decades of suppression. But as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final lingering image from the source material that I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over.
It's a powerful one.
Yeah. When Ali Safavi was critiquing the idea of returning to a monarchy, the broadcast mentioned a very specific detail. Recently, in some European cities, the few individuals had marched wearing the uniforms of the Savak.
The much-feared secret police of the former Shah.
Exactly, and the interview noted that the Guardian newspaper in the UK had called those uniforms the most hated symbol of suppression from that era.
The resistance points to this revulsion to argue that the Iranian people completely reject a return to any past dictatorship, whether it is royal or religious.
Right. The visceral reaction to that uniform proves that national trauma isn't just about the present moment, it's cumulative.
Absolutely.
So here's the question to take with you. When a nation seeks to build a totally new democratic future, how does the traumatic memory of not just one, but multiple past regimes shape the very definition of the freedom they're fighting for today?
It's a heavy thought.
It is. If the current regime's DNA is suppression, and pulling that pillar out brings the whole building down, what kind of foundation must be poured to ensure the new building isn't just a copy of the old ones? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we continue to explore the fascinating arguments and insights hidden in the world's information.